Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Annette T. Rottenberg and Donna Winchell's The Structure of Argument. So this is a first-year composition textbook. It's the one that I've taught out of this semester, fall 2024. Yeah, it's a comp textbook. So this is kind of always the challenging thing for me when reviewing a composition textbook in any way is composition textbooks are composition textbooks to a certain extent. Like, they tend to be very similar in terms of the content that's covered. They will often talk about things in similar ways, in part because across the board, what we usually teach in first-year writing courses, first-year rhetoric and composition courses, is generally pretty similar. And that's not a problem. I mean, it means that these textbooks tend to fulfill their function. That being said, I quite like the structure of argument. It's probably one that I'm going to stick with if I get assigned first-year composition again, because I think it's got some really good strengths, and there's a couple of things that personally I was not that pleased with about it. So, I mean, structure of argument across the board, right? It is first and foremost a textbook. So it does the kinds of things a textbook does. Yeah, great. Okay. Like, here's a random page. This is the first one I just opened it to. You've got your standard sorts of things, sections, section breaks, in this case, claims of policy, and then key terms bolded. This page only has these claims bolded, so that's not necessarily the best example, but find you another one. A lot of what I'm immediately flipping to is okay, so here's one. Main claim thesis, right? Key terms bolded. There you go, standard stuff. We got a diagram here, the rhetorical triangle. One thing they tend to include, again, this is a standard textbook thing, is sort of summations at the end of chapters or sections that give you key points, discussion questions, things like this, all of which you can definitely use as an instructor if you want to. You can use these discussion questions, writing suggestions, things like this. We've got, your standard boxes with important information pulled out, etc., etc. Again, all standard textbook stuff, generally quite solid, quite readable. And that's actually an interesting difference in first-year composition textbooks, which you wouldn't think would be that much of a difference because they're written for writing classes, right? So you would think, normally, that they would all be well written. Some of them are dry. They are textbooks after all. So there is that sort of tension between this is a dry textbook versus this is written for first-year writing to try and get students to write as well as possible. And so it should, theoretically, be well written. I think Rottenberg and Winchell's textbook is pretty well written for the most part. I think it's generally clear. The information is accessible. They give sort of illustrative examples that are usually useful, etc., etc. So overall, pretty good. Structure of argument also includes a lot of reading samples, which I really like. I actually chose, I think, 15 or so of the readings included in this textbook. And I made that the sort of rhetorical texts bank for when my students did a group rhetorical evaluation project. They had to look at one of the sample essays out of this textbook. And yeah, it generally worked quite well. They were able to do pretty good analysis and evaluation of these texts. And they cover a wide range of things, right? So I tried to pick things that would appeal to a number of students' potential interests. We had environmentalism, we had women's and gender studies, we had sports stuff, we had political stuff. So we had a wide range of things that students could take an interest in. So hopefully they were able to find something that would at least connect to something that they were into. One other thing I do like about the readings here is they will sometimes have a student sample paired with a professional example. So, for instance, starting on page 36, they have Bruce Schneer's "The Internet is a Surveillance State." And then immediately after that, starting on page 39, they have Whitney Kramer's "Giving Up Our Privacy, Is It Worth It?", which is a response to the Schneer essay. So you get that sort of nice pairing of here's a professionally written argument, and then here is a student response to it. And that's very, very useful because you can use that as an instructor to sort of say, okay, what has this student done effectively? What have they done differently? Maybe you could have your students practice rewriting this to strengthen it, to strengthen any weaknesses, whatever it is. So you can do that sort of analytical work. And because it's a student essay, the students in your class are probably more likely to feel prepared to critique it and to offer suggestions about how it can be improved. So I think those, and they have a few of those. So I think those pairings are really nice. On the other side, there's a few things that I wasn't really a fan of with this textbook, which may or may not bother other people. So one absence for me is that this textbook does not really talk about personal narratives or narrative arguments, creative nonfiction, that kind of thing. And that's fine. There's a number of other genres of writing, of potential first year comp types of assignments that aren't covered. I happen to teach a personal narrative assignment, so there wasn't any real material I could assign out of this textbook for that. So that's what that was. It wasn't a huge issue for me, but that, again, if the personal narrative was a major part of your first year comp course, this just doesn't have information about it. And then a couple of other things. So one is, I think their presentation of the Toulmin model is really incomplete. And for me, that's always been a component that I teach in my first year writing course. The Toulmin model is very central to the way that we build academic arguments. And the way that Rottenberg and Winchell present it is essentially as an enthymeme. It's claim, evidence, and warrants, which isn't the Toulmin model. It's the core of the Toulmin model, but there's additional elements like backing and qualifiers that are important components that distinguish the Toulmin model from earlier models. So it's incomplete, and because that structure, that enthymeme structure of claim, evidence, interpretation is discussed elsewhere in the textbook, this kind of feels redundant. It doesn't, from this presentation of the Toulmin model, it doesn't feel like this is a thing that's new and different and sort of worth giving space to. And so as an instructor, I had to, expand on this, which is totally fine because I would teach my students about the Toolman model anyway, but that's a missing component in my view. The other thing that I was not thrilled with, but this isn't a huge problem necessarily. So I'm ambivalent about the MLA works cited entries section. What I like is, again, standard textbook stuff. It's got a directory of entries, perfectly fine. It includes the entry number and the page number where you can find it. Good. But then when you go to the actual, thing itself. So if we take a look at this one for a chapter, you have a model of that entry, which is very useful if you know what this information means. What we don't have is the sort of standard template bit where it would be like last name, comma, first name, title in quotation marks with period, title of the book in italics, whatever it is. So it gives us examples, but it depends on students to be able to figure out what piece of information is represented in that sample. And there are a few major citations that are pulled out, and they do the sort of full page thing. So that's really useful, as always, where it goes through. When you cite a book using MLA style, include the following: author, title and subtitle, publisher, date of publication. Yeah, so for those few, it definitely does do that. But if it's, say, an edition other than the first, all that we have is the sample. If it's an editorial or letter to the editor, all that we have is the sample. We don't have an explanation of what these pieces of information are. So I do think that's challenging for students, because students often do not have a good sense of the type of information that goes into a citation, why it goes into a citation the way that it does. And structure of argument, in my view, just doesn't really give them enough information to understand that. Now, of course, if you supplement that by teaching your students MLA, that's a great thing. I do a crash course in MLA, but we devote a day to it. And that's really not enough time to fully understand the intricacies of MLA format and why it works the way it works. So, yeah, I think that's a limitation as well. But that being said, those are comparatively minor issues. And overall, I think the textbook is very good. Again, I would assign it again if I teach another first-year comp course. I think it is generally quite strong.